Here's a question that breaks economics. If economic laws can only be discovered through data, experiments, and statistical studies, the way mainstream economists insist, then why does socialism fail in exactly the same way every single time, regardless of culture, geography, or era? Venezuela, 2020s. Soviet Union, 1980s. Maoist China, 1960s. Same pattern. Price controls, then shortages, then black markets, then collapse. Different continents, different decades, different leaders. Identical failure sequence. If economic laws are just empirical observations that might change with new data, why this perfect repetition? You know what drives mainstream economists crazy? They can't explain this. They blame implementation, or corruption, or not real socialism. But they can't explain why the pattern is so predictable you could set your watch by it. Ludwig von Mises explained it in 1922, before most of these disasters even happened. He predicted the Soviet collapse decades in advance. Not because he had a crystal ball, not because he ran sophisticated statistical models, because he understood something called praxeology. That word probably sounds academic and intimidating. It isn't. It's actually the simplest, most obvious way of thinking about human behavior you've ever encountered. But it's also the most revolutionary. Because once you grasp it, you'll understand why certain economic laws are certain as 2 + 2 = 4, and why no amount of good intentions or clever planning can violate them. Every time you hear studies show, or the data suggests, or according to our economic models, you're hearing the opposite of praxeological thinking. You're hearing people who believe economic truth comes from observing the past and hoping patterns continue. Mises showed why that's backwards. Economic laws don't come from counting and measuring. They come from one undeniable fact about you, me, and every human who ever lived. And from that single fact, we can deduce, with absolute logical certainty, truths about economics that no statistic can ever refute. I know that sounds bold, almost arrogant, but notice how you're already acting on praxeological principles right now, in this very moment. Even if you've never heard the word before, you're watching this video because you want to understand something. That desire for understanding is driving your current action. You could be doing literally anything else right now, but you're here because you've decided this is more valuable to you than those alternatives. That's it. That's the foundation of praxeology. Everything else, everything Mises built, all the economic laws he proved, flows logically from that simple observation. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how Mises transformed that obvious fact into an ironclad method for discovering economic truth. You'll understand why he could predict socialism's failure with certainty, while Nobel Prize winners couldn't see it coming. And you'll learn to think about economics in a way that makes you immune to statistical manipulation and political propaganda. If you want to discover more revolutionary ideas from thinkers who saw what others missed, subscribe to this channel where we explore the minds that shaped and can save the free world. Let me start with something so obvious it feels almost stupid to say out loud. Humans act. Not most humans most of the time. Not humans in certain conditions. Just humans act. Period. You're acting right now. I acted when I decided to make this video. Your neighbor acted when she went to work this morning. The guy who cut you off in traffic yesterday acted. This is what Mises called the axiom of action, the starting point of all praxeology. And here's what makes it special. You literally cannot deny it, because the very act of denying it proves it true. Watch this. Imagine someone says, humans don't act. We're just responding mechanically to stimuli like sophisticated robots. Okay, did that person choose to make that argument? Did they select those words? Did they aim to convince you of something? Then they acted. Their denial of action is itself an action. Game over. You know what fascinates me most about this? Mises found the one starting point in all of social science that's absolutely undeniable. Physics can debate quantum mechanics. Biology can argue about evolution's mechanisms. But nobody, literally nobody, can coherently deny that humans act. Sure, you might be thinking, but that's so basic. What can you possibly build from something that obvious? Everything. You can build everything. Because action isn't random. When you act, you're doing something specific. You're watching this video, not mowing the lawn. You're reading this sentence, not calling your mother. Every action involves choosing one thing and not choosing countless alternatives. And why? Because you prefer the thing you chose. You value this video's information more than the satisfaction of a mowed lawn right now. That preference might change. 5 minutes from now, you might decide the lawn matters more. But in this moment, your action reveals your preference. Notice what just happened. From the undeniable fact that humans act, we've already derived a second certain truth. Action reveals preference. We didn't need a survey. We didn't need to measure anything. We just thought logically about what action necessarily involves. This is praxeology in motion. Start with what's undeniable. Think carefully about what that necessarily implies. Derive certain truths through pure logic. Mises contrasted this with what he called parallelism, the idea that logic itself differs between groups. Marxists claimed workers think differently than capitalists. Nazis claimed Aryans think differently than Jews. Modern identity politics claims oppressed groups have different ways of knowing. Praxeology destroys all of that. If you act, you demonstrate the same fundamental structure of human action as everyone else. The content of our goals differs. You want pizza? I want tacos. But the form of purposeful action? Universal. Logic isn't white or male or Western. It's human. Here's where it gets really interesting. If all humans act purposefully, choosing based on preferences, then certain patterns must emerge. Not might emerge, must emerge, as in logically necessary. And these necessary patterns? Those are economic laws, not descriptions of how people happen to behave last year in a particular place. Logical truths about how purposeful action necessarily functions in a world of scarcity. Let me show you what I mean with something simple. The law of marginal utility. Imagine you're incredibly hungry, haven't eaten in 10 hours. Someone offers you a slice of pizza. How much do you value it? Enormously. You might pay $20 for that slice if you had to. Now you eat it. Hunger partially satisfied. They offer you a second slice. Still want it? Sure. But how much would you pay? Maybe $10. It's valuable, but not as desperately needed as a first slice. Third slice? $5. Fourth? $2. Fifth? No thanks, I'm full. What just happened? The pizza didn't change, but its value to you declined with each unit. Not because pizza is objectively worth less as you eat more, because you, the acting human, value each additional unit less as your most urgent need gets satisfied. This is a law of diminishing marginal utility. And notice, we didn't discover it by surveying 10,000 pizza eaters and calculating an average. We derived it logically from the axiom of action. If you act to satisfy your most urgent needs first, which you must, because acting requires preferring one thing to alternatives, then subsequent units of the same good necessarily satisfy less urgent needs. Therefore, they're necessarily valued less. Has to be true. Can't not be true. Like 2 + 2 = 4. You know what's beautiful about this? It's why Mises could predict economic outcomes with certainty while empiricists could only guess. Mainstream economists in the 1920s looked at Soviet central planning and thought, well, we'll have to wait and see if it works. We need data. They were thinking empirically, observation first, conclusions later. Mises thought praxeologically. He reasoned. Economic calculation requires prices. Prices require private property and trade. Central planning eliminates private property in production goods. Therefore, central planning eliminates rational economic calculation. Therefore, it must fail. Done. No waiting for data. Logical certainty. And he was right. 70 years before the Soviet collapse, he explained exactly why it would collapse. Because he was thinking from axioms, not from observations. Let me show you how this works with something you deal with right now. Inflation. The government prints money, creates new dollars that didn't exist before. Mainstream economists scramble to measure money supply and velocity and run complex models to predict inflation rates. Praxeology cuts through all that. If the supply of dollars increases while the supply of actual goods remains constant, what must happen to each dollar's purchasing power? Must decrease. Why? Because humans act to achieve goals with scarce means. If means become less scarce, more dollars, their value in achieving goals necessarily declines. You don't need historical data about past inflationary episodes. You don't need to measure anything. The logic is airtight. More units of money plus same amount of goods equals each unit of money buys less. Economic law derived from action axiom. But wait, you might be thinking, don't we still need some empirical observation? How do we know the dollar supply actually increased or that goods stayed constant? Great question. And yes, to apply praxeological laws to specific situations, we need factual data about those situations. Mises called this understanding as opposed to pure theory. We need to know historical facts. Did the Fed print money? By how much? What happened to production? But here's the crucial distinction. The economic law itself, increasing money supply decreases purchasing power, isn't discovered through observation. It's logically derived. The observation just tells us whether the conditions for applying that law exist in a particular case. Think of it like geometry. The angles of a triangle summed to 180 degrees is true by logical necessity, not by measuring a bunch of triangles. But to know if this particular shape is a triangle, you do need to observe it. That's the power of praxeology. It gives you certain economic laws independent of historical contingency. Then you use those laws to interpret the historical facts you observe. Here comes a really interesting part. The reason Mises' method is so threatening to establishment economics. If economic laws are logically derived from undeniable axioms, then they're true regardless of what politicians want, what voters believe, or what the experts recommend. You can't vote away the law of diminishing marginal utility. You can't stimulus package your way around the economic calculation problem. You can't print money without decreasing its purchasing power, no matter how many PhDs say this time is different. This is why you'll almost never hear about praxeology in university economics departments. Not because it's wrong. Nobody can refute it logically, because it's inconvenient. The entire Keynesian project depends on treating economics like physics. Observe, measure, build models, intervene based on data. If the models are wrong, collect more data, build better models, get a bigger computer. Praxeology says that's fundamentally backwards. Economic laws aren't empirical generalizations that might stop working. They're logical necessities that can't stop working because they flow from the structure of human action itself. As long as humans act purposefully with scarce means, praxeological laws apply. To violate them, humans would have to stop acting altogether, which is impossible because even stopping action is an action. Let me show you how this exposes a con in modern economic policy. Politician says, we'll raise the minimum wage to $20 per hour. Studies show it doesn't reduce employment. Praxeological response. If employers must pay more for labor than that labor produces in value, they will employ less of it. This isn't prediction based on past data. It's a logical necessity. An employer who consistently pays workers more than they produce goes bankrupt. Therefore, mandating above market wages must reduce employment for marginal workers. But the studies measure past instances under specific conditions and hope the pattern continues. Praxeology reveals what must happen given the nature of human action. When your statistical study contradicts logical law, your study is wrong. Wrong measurement, wrong interpretation, wrong variables. The logic can't be wrong. This is what drove Mises crazy about the empirical turn in economics. Economists abandoned reasoning from principles and started treating economics like meteorology. Collect data, spot patterns, predict based on past weather. But weather doesn't act purposefully. Humans do. And purposeful action follows logical laws that no amount of measurement can change. If this revelation is hitting you the way it hit me when I first understood it, show someone else this truth. Share this video with someone who's ready to think more clearly about economics than the experts do. You know what this means practically? It means you can know certain economic truths with more certainty than any PhD economist who relies only on data. You don't need to wait for the studies to tell you whether socialism works. You can deduce logically that it must fail. You don't need statistical models to know whether printing money causes inflation. The logic is undeniable. This is incredibly empowering. While economists with Nobel Prizes confidently assert nonsense based on their fancy models, you, armed with praxeological reasoning, can identify the errors in their thinking with absolute certainty, not with 95% confidence intervals, not with the data suggests, with logical necessity. Mises lived this. While prestigious economists praised Soviet planning as the future, he explained precisely why it would collapse. While famous theorists claimed inflation could boost employment, he showed logically why it couldn't create real wealth. He was right, they were wrong. Not because he was smarter, because his method was correct. And that same method, starting with the undeniable axiom that humans act, then reasoning carefully about what that implies, is available to you right now. Let me show you what happens when economists reject praxeology and try other methods instead. First method, pure empiricism. Let's just collect data and see what happens. Sounds scientific, right? Just observe reality objectively, without theoretical bias. Problem: you can't observe anything without a theoretical framework for interpreting what you're seeing. When you measure unemployment, you're already working with a theory about what counts as employment, what counts as looking for work, who's in the labor force. Every measurement requires categories. Categories require theory. Theory requires reasoning from principles. You can't escape praxeology. You can only do it badly by not recognizing you're doing it. Worse, pure empiricism can only tell you what happened, not why. Venezuela's economy collapsed. That's observable. But why? Without logical economic theory, you can only guess at correlations. Maybe it was the oil price, maybe corruption, maybe bad luck. Praxeology explains why. They destroyed the price system, made economic calculation impossible, and systematic impoverishment necessarily followed. The collapse wasn't bad luck. It was logically inevitable. Second method, mathematical modeling. Let's use equations to make economics rigorous like physics. This is what mainstream economics has done since the 1950s. Build elaborate mathematical models of the economy and run simulations. Problem: economic equations require assuming what you're trying to discover. You have to assume how consumers respond to price changes, how firms maximize profit, how markets reach equilibrium. All those assumptions embed theoretical claims about human action. And those claims are either consistent with praxeology, in which case the math is just a complicated way of expressing what logic already proved, or inconsistent with praxeology, in which case the math is elegantly wrong. You can't derive economic laws from math. Math is a language for expressing relationships, but you have to know what those relationships are first. And how do you know? By reasoning from the axiom of action. The mathematical proof that minimum wage doesn't reduce employment. It assumes employers don't respond to price signals the way praxeology shows they must. The model is internally consistent. The math is fine. But it contradicts logical necessity about how humans act with scarce means. Third method, behavioral economics. Let's use psychology experiments to discover how people really behave. Recent Nobel Prizes have gone to economists who show people aren't perfectly rational in controlled experiments. Therefore, traditional economics needs updating. Praxeology's response: of course people aren't perfectly rational if you define rationality as instantaneous calculation of optimal outcomes. But that's not what the axiom of action claims. The axiom says, People act purposefully using means they believe will achieve ends a value that's compatible with mistakes, emotion, changing preferences, limited information. All the things behavioral economists discover. What it's not compatible with is the idea that people act randomly or that logical laws don't constrain behavior. You might irrationally overpay for coffee due to clever marketing, but you still necessarily value that coffee more than the money at the moment of purchase. Otherwise, you wouldn't buy it. The law of preference revelation still holds. Behavioral economics makes the same mistake as pure empiricism. Treating humans as objects to be studied from outside rather than understanding action from within its own logical structure. Notice the pattern across all these alternatives? They try to make economics more scientific by copying natural science methods: observation, measurement, experimentation, mathematical prediction. But economics isn't about objects that behave according to physical laws. It's about subjects who act according to purposes. The proper method for understanding purposeful action is an experiment and measurement. It's logical reasoning from what action necessarily involves. This is why Mises titled his masterwork Human Action, not economic data or market models or mathematical economics. The entire science flows from understanding what it means to act. And you understand action from inside by reflecting on your own purposeful behavior and reasoning about what that implies, not by treating yourself as an outsider observing human behavior, like you'd observe ant colonies. So what does this mean for your actual life? How does praxeological thinking change the way you navigate the economic world? First, it makes you immune to statistical manipulation. Next time you hear studies show rent control doesn't reduce housing supply, or data proves government spending stimulates the economy, you can think, does that claim violate praxeological law? If landlords are forced to charge less than market price, they must reduce supply or quality. That's not an empirical prediction. It's a logical necessity. Anyone acting to maximize profit by renting property must respond to below market prices by supplying less. Therefore, any study claiming otherwise either measured the wrong thing or looked at too short a time frame to capture the necessary effect. You don't need to scrutinize their methodology or check their data. You know they're wrong because they contradict logical law. Second, it gives you predictive power the experts lack. When the government announces a new intervention, price controls, subsidies, regulations, monetary expansion, you can reason praxeologically about necessary consequences while economists are still waiting for the data. Subsidized college tuition? Praxeology predicts demand for college increases. Prices rise to capture subsidy. Students graduate with more debt. Not because that's what happened before, because that's what must happen when you artificially increase purchasing power for a specific good. And sure enough, decades of subsidies later, skyrocketing tuition and crushing student debt. Mises could have told you this in 1920. Modern economists needed 50 years of data to possibly admit there's a problem. Third, it protects you from utopian thinking. Every political promise of free healthcare, housing, education, or income relies on violating praxeological laws. We'll just legislate abundance into existence. But humans act with scarce means to achieve unlimited ends. Scarcity isn't a policy choice. It's a fundamental condition of action. You can redistribute existing wealth. You can't wish away scarcity through legislation. When politicians promise something for nothing, you recognize the con immediately, not because you're cynical, because you understand action. Fourth, it makes you a better decision maker. Because you understand action as choosing highest valued alternatives from scarce options, you naturally think in terms of trade-offs. Nothing is free. Every choice has an opportunity cost. Should you go to college? Praxeological thinking asks, what's the opportunity cost? For years of foregone income plus tuition versus the discounted future income gain from a degree. Compare subjective values. Decide. The person who doesn't think praxeologically just thinks college is good without weighing trade-offs. They act, but they don't reflect on the structure of action itself. Finally, and this is huge, it gives you intellectual confidence in an age of expert gaslighting. When every authority figure insists you need credentials to understand economics, praxeology reveals that economics is fundamentally accessible to anyone who can reason logically from undeniable axioms. You don't need a PhD to understand that price controls cause shortages. You need to think carefully about what happens when you prevent people from adjusting terms of exchange to mutual benefit. That's available to any honest thinker. Mises never had a real academic job. The prestigious universities rejected him. The Nobel Prize Committee ignored him. Why? Not because his logic was wrong. Nobody could refute it. Because his conclusions threatened powerful interests that fund economics departments. But he was right, and he knew he was right with certainty, because he was reasoning from undeniable axioms. You can have that same certainty. Not about everything. You'll still need empirical data about specific historical circumstances, but about core economic principles, absolute logical certainty. That's the gift of praxeology. It's not just a fancy methodology for academic economics. It's a way of thinking that empowers you to see through manipulation, predict consequences, and understand economic reality with more clarity than most credentialed experts. Look at what just happened in your mind over the last 15 minutes. You started with a simple question about why socialism fails so predictably. You're ending with a completely different framework for understanding economic truth itself. That's not an accident. That's praxeology doing what it does. Started with the undeniable and building systematically to conclusions most people never reach. You now understand that economic laws aren't statistical generalizations that might change with new data. They're logical necessities flowing from the undeniable fact that humans act. You can't repeal them. You can't vote against them. You can't stimulus package your way around them. This completely changes how you evaluate economic claims. When someone says the data shows something that contradicts praxeological law, you know the data is wrong, not the law. The law is logically certain. The data is provisional, context-dependent, and easily manipulated. When politicians promise prosperity through intervention, you recognize immediately that they're either ignorant of praxeological laws or lying about them. Either way, the promised prosperity won't materialize, can't materialize. The logic forbids it. And when economists with prestigious credentials insist that this time is different, whether about inflation, central planning, price controls, or deficit spending, you can smile and think, no, it isn't. Human action hasn't changed. Therefore, the laws governing action haven't changed. Therefore, the consequences won't change. That's extraordinary power. While others are confused and manipulated by statistical smoke and mirrors, you see clearly, not because you're smarter, because you're thinking from correct principles. Mises gave you this gift. He devoted his life to developing and defending praxeology precisely so people like you, intellectually honest people outside the corrupt academic political establishment, could understand economic truth for themselves. You don't need permission from experts to think clearly about economics. You need only to start with what's undeniable, humans act, and reason carefully about what that implies. The rest follows with logical necessity. Starting today, when you encounter economic claims, in news articles, political speeches, social media debates, practice praxeological thinking. First, identify the claim about economic cause and effect. Raising taxes on the rich will reduce inequality. Printing money will stimulate the economy. Rent control will make housing affordable. Second, reason from the action axiom. If this policy is implemented, how must acting humans respond? Forced to pay more, they'll produce less or work less or hide income. Given more money with same goods, each dollar must purchase less. Prevented from charging market prices, suppliers must reduce quantity or quality. Third, ask whether the claim violates what must necessarily follow from purposeful action with scarce means. If it does, reject the claim, regardless of who's making it or what credentials they have. You don't need to become an economic scholar. You don't need to memorize Mises's complete works. You just need to remember, humans act purposefully with scarce means to achieve valued ends. And think carefully about what that necessarily implies in specific situations. Within weeks, you'll find yourself seeing through economic nonsense that fools even educated people. You'll predict policy consequences that surprise experts. You'll understand why certain outcomes are inevitable while others are impossible. Not because you've mastered complex theory, because you're thinking from first principles, from the undeniable axiom that you and everyone else acts. That's praxeology. That's Mises's gift to you. Use it. The world desperately needs people who can think clearly about economic reality. And clear thinking starts with understanding action. Mises wrote something in the introduction to Human Action that I can't forget. Economics is not about goods and services. It is about the actions of living men. Do you feel the weight of that truth? Economics isn't fundamentally about GDP, inflation rates, or market indices. It's about you, your choices, your values, your attempt to improve your circumstances using scarce means. And because it's about action, your action, you have direct access to economic truth through reflection on your own purposeful behavior. You don't need complex instruments or years of training. You need honest, rigorous thinking about what you already know from inside, what it means to act. Imagine your life 6 months from now, after absorbing praxeological thinking into how you process the world. You won't be confused by contradictory economic claims from competing experts. You'll evaluate them against logical necessity and know which ones are nonsense. You won't be manipulated by political promises of prosperity through intervention. You'll recognize immediately which promises violate laws of action and must fail. You'll make better personal decisions about career, investment, business, savings, because you'll naturally think in terms of trade-offs, opportunity costs, and the necessary consequences of action. Most importantly, you'll think for yourself about economic matters with confidence that you're reasoning correctly, even when prestigious voices tell you otherwise. This channel exists to help you discover the wisdom of thinkers like Mises, people who saw through the illusions of their age and taught us to think from permanent principles rather than passing fashions. Subscribe if you want to continue building your understanding of Austrian economics, conservative philosophy, and clear thinking about reality. In the next video, we'll explore how Mises used praxeology to solve the calculation problem and predict socialism's inevitable failure, decades before it happened. See you there, and meanwhile, may truth set you free.